everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So, know too much syndrome. I've been talking about it, every now and then, and that is essentially when you know more than certain characters in the movie. This can sometimes create great tension. Dial M for Murder is a good example of that, but sometimes, most of the times actually, it creates frustration for you as an audience. Come on, don't you know that, he's over there, or that's the murderer, or something like that. It can also squander any form of tension or suspense that, you could have built without knowing this thing. I think that Double Jeopardy, the movie that we're gonna take a look at today, suffers a lot from it. To the point where I think that is actually one of the main reasons why this movie ultimately doesn't work. But it's not all bad, but let's find out what is good, what is bad, and what is in between with this movie. This is Double Jeopardy. A wealthy couple, Nick and Libby, played by the way by Ashley Judd, and they're going on this romantic sailing experience. They live on the coast of Washington state, and Angela, her best friend, is going to take care of Maddie, her son, when they're away on this little excursion. But she wakes up covered in blood, and there are blood everywhere on the boat, and a bloody knife, and then the law shows up, and she is tried and convicted of murder without there being a body presence because Nick is gone. She's also informed of the fact that he was going to be charged with embezzlement, and there was also this big life insurance that was taken out on him that they believe is the motivations for her to kill him, so she could benefit from his death. And Angela, by the way, gets custody of Maddie because Libby doesn't want him to become an orphan and living in an orphanage or stuff like that. So she starts serving her jail sentence with the goal of coming out and reuniting with Maddie, because he's the only one that matters to her now. And they're coming to visit and stuff like that, but all of a sudden the visits stop happening. No Angela and no Maddie, and she starts wondering, where have they gone? And after some digging around, she tracks them down to San Francisco, and she, calls them up, and Maddie answers, and during the conversation, somebody opens the door, and he says, "Daddy!" And she discovers that Nick is somehow still alive. He must have faked his own death. Anyway, this means that she's wrongfully convicted of the murder. However, nobody wants to listen to her and just thinks that she's crazy, and she wants to invent, some excuse for them to let her out, or, stuff like that. The thing is that another inmate who used to be a lawyer tells her essentially that, well, if Nick is still alive, then you could just walk up to him and shoot him. You cannot be convicted of the same crime twice. So if you just, behave nicely and show remorse, then you will be able to, make parole, and then you can just, track him down wherever he has gone to and take revenge and shoot him. And after 6 years, she is eligible for parole, and she gets a parole officer to, watch over her, Travis, played by Tommy Lee Jones. And she, of course, escapes from his clutches and starts to investigating why Nick faked his own death, and where he has gone, and what has happened to Maddie, and if the fact that Angela has died in a gas explosion is a accident or not, with Travis hot on her tail because he wants to capture her, who of course does not believe that Nick is alive and just think that she is a murderer on the loose. And her motivation is not necessarily just to kill Nick, but she also wants to reunite with Maddie, who has sort of disappeared, sort of. Is she going to be able to find him? And will she be able to execute her revenge? That's what this movie is about. So, why does this movie not work? Well, essentially you could boil it down to this. We know that Nick is alive, and she knows that Nick is alive. But Travis, he does not know that Nick is alive, and when he trying to figure out why she's doing this and if there is any state her claim and stuff like that, it doesn't work. It just bogs down the movie. Now, if this movie would have been shot with Tommy Lee Jones in the leading role, and we would have seen everything from his point of view, not knowing that Nick was alive, then we would have seen that he would have done the deduction. He would have seen that, well, there is this thing with the embezzlement, and this guy does kind of look like Nick, but is that so, or is she just chasing ghosts and things like that? That is something that could have worked, but there is also a risk that that would have just looked like yet another sequel to The Fugitive, but on the other hand, we could have done worse. The other option that I can see is maybe that we could have done some kind of a psychological thriller about this thing, that she, when she finds Nick, starts blackmailing him, or that she starts doing psychological terror on him. And we could have done a lot of stuff here, but her motivation is more about finding Maddie and bringing him home, rather than the revenge thing. The revenge thing is kind of secondary to the search for Nick. So this becomes a very bog standard thriller. Now, it is saved by the very good performances, because Ashley Judd and Tommy Lee Jones are two of my favorite actors, and they put on a very good performance that essentially this movie does not deserve. The thing is that the setup is so great that they could have done so many other things that would have benefited this movie, but they chose the absolutely easiest option at every turn, and it did not benefit this movie at all. There is really no suspense here, and all the things that happens in the second and third act of this movie is not as exciting as the premise that is presented in the first act. So this movie is not very well structured, it's not very well written, and it isn't very interesting. At least this movie is not a 144 monstrosity, which was a little bit of a trend at the time. 105 minutes is absolutely perfect, it never overstays its welcome, but then we get, of course, to the ending of this movie that is very underwhelming and very cliched, and was ultimately a letdown, even though they had that fantastic killer line delivered by Tommy Lee Jones. I would not be surprised if that was the first thing they figured out. Hey, what about if Tommy Lee Jones would say this kind of a line, in a situation? That's great, they said. Let's structure the movie around that thing. And that's essentially what they did. It isn't a bad movie. It's just a bit of a meh. It's not a movie that you are very, engaged in, and you don't really care what's going to happen, because it is so obvious where we are going, and it is not a movie that, challenges you in any way, and it doesn't have that much suspense to it at all, because we already know what the mystery is. If they could have structured the movie maybe around, is that actually Nick? Or if it could have been made more of a, is she going insane, or is she chasing ghosts or stuff like that, maybe that could have worked. But now we have a bunch of really underwhelming sequences that doesn't really benefit this movie at all. It is not a bad movie, it is just a forgettable movie that ultimately fizzles out to, it was fine. Good performances but underwhelming writing in this very standard late 90s thriller. I give Double Jeopardy anyway 41 points. It is a totally okay movie, and it is vastly helped by our two main characters, and virtually everything else is stuff that we've seen before, and when we have seen it, it has been better. So I'll see you next time for, well, so and so reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.